Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a stack of sources, all focused on one of the really big ones, the Roswell UFO crash mystery from 47.
And those equally mysterious Majestic 12 documents, the MJ-12 stuff.
Exactly. Our source material for this particular deep dive, it's excerpts from Case MJ-12, the true story behind the government's UFO conspiracies.
Right. And we're really going to try and unpack what this text specifically presents. We're looking at the arguments, the evidence, just what's inside its pages.
Yeah, our mission is basically to understand the claims from this source about Roswell, about MJ-12, and this idea of a possible, real government oversight committee hiding somewhere, but strictly sticking to what this book tells us.
Trying to sort fact from fiction, but only using the lens of this one particular source. It's important to remember that.
Okay, let's dig in. So let's start right there at the beginning. Roswell, 1947. What does this source actually lay out about what happened?
Well, it kicks off with quite a bang, really, a headline. July 8th, 1947. Colonel William Blanchard. He was the commander of the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield.
Right, the atomic bomb group.
That's the one. He puts out this press release, tells the Roswell Daily Record they've captured a crashed flying saucer on a local ranch.
Wait, sorry, a crashed flying saucer. In an official military press release, that seems incredibly bold.
It definitely got people's attention, that's for sure. And the release specifically named Major Jesse A. Marcel, the base intelligence officer, and the local sheriff, George Wilcox.
Okay, so Marcel's account must be pretty key then, right? The source mentions an interview he gave to Stringfield. What did he say he found?
Well, Marcel said Blanchard sent him out to check what was first just reported as maybe an explosion. He gets out there, finds this huge field, maybe a mile square, scattered with metal fragments and this other stuff he called parchment.
What was the metal like? Just regular debris?
No, that's the thing. According to Marcel, these fragments, some up to 6 inches or so, were super thin, like tinfoil. But, and this is crucial, he said they had great strength. He apparently couldn't bend them, could break them by hand. And he was very clear, this stuff did not look like anything from a weather balloon or a radar target, which you would have recognized.
Right, which is important because that became the official story pretty fast, didn't it? The source says a military team came in right after and basically raked the entire area.
Yeah, sounds like a real thorough cleanup effort.
Yeah.
Then you got the rancher, Mac Brazel. He's the guy who actually found the main debris field first, spread over maybe 200 yards.
What did he describe seeing?
He mentioned smoky gray rubber, strips of it, and this sort of paper or foil material with eyelets in it. He apparently tried to put it back together, maybe make a kite, but couldn't figure it out. Said he never saw it fall, just found it.
And he took it into Roswell, Marcel got involved, and then the flying disc story hit the papers. Did Brazel compare it to anything else he'd found out there?
Yeah, he told people, look, I've found weather balloons out here before, more than once. This wasn't that. It was different.
And he made that famous comment.
Right. The source quotes him saying something like, if he ever found anything else on his ranch short of a dom, he wasn't telling anybody about it.
Wow. That really shows the kind of pressure he must have been under almost immediately. And his son, Bill Brazel Jr., the source mentions his testimony too.
Yes. Bill Jr. said later that his father was basically sworn to secrecy by the Air Force, took the details to his grave, never told anyone exactly what he saw after that initial fuss.
Did Bill Jr. find anything himself?
He did, yeah. He said he found some bits later on, and he described Air Force guys coming out to get the samples from him. Said they didn't, confiscate it, but they made him feel very strongly he should give it to them,
That subtle pressure. What did he say the material was like? Similar description.
His description adds a bit more detail, maybe slightly different. He mentioned stuff that looked like balsa wood, but wasn't wood. Something like heavy gauge monofilament fishing line and a foil-like piece that wasn't aluminum or lead foil he knew. So you start getting these varied descriptions of weird materials.
And the source emphasizes how quickly the military got control of the narrative, right?
Absolutely. Sheriff Wilcox's wife apparently said he was told straight up, send all calls to the base.
Yeah.
Don't talk. Information sources just dried up or were funneled through the military.
And then General Ramey at the 8th Air Force HQ in Fort Worth steps in with the plausible explanation.
Exactly. The weather balloon story. And poor Major Marcel gets photographed holding up wreckage that was clearly identified later as just a standard weather balloon radar target.
It really paints a picture, based just on this source text, of a very fast, very coordinated clampdown on the initial story.
Definitely looks that way from these accounts.
Which leads to that big question the source poses. Okay, if Roswell was real, if it involved something, not from Earth, wouldn't you almost expect some kind of high-level secret committee to pop up immediately to figure out what it was and, well, exploit it?
It seems like the logical next step, doesn't it? If you suddenly have potentially revolutionary technology or
Mhm.
proof of something else, you'd want your best people on it, figuring it out, keeping it quiet.
So, okay, let's move beyond the immediate Roswell aftermath. What does the source say about the military's early investigations into this whole flying saucer thing that might hint at such a committee existing?
Well, the military was definitely scrambling after Kenneth Arnold's sightings in June 47. That really kicked off the public craze, so they had to investigate. A Project Sign was officially started in early 48 at Wright Field that later became Blue Book.
And weren't there other incidents around that time that really worried them, like Maury Island?
Maury Island happened just before Roswell, June 47. Involved harbor patrol guys claiming they saw a damaged craft, maybe recovered some material, described a donut-like shape. The source says Kenneth Arnold himself and an airline pilot, Captain E.J. Smith, they initially believed the story. They even felt their hotel room was bugged when they went to investigate.
But what's the final verdict on Maury Island, according to the source?
This source is pretty clear. It concludes Maury Island was likely a hoax. The material turned out to be just industrial slag. And one main witness, a guy named Chrisman, apparently admitted later he basically told the publisher, Ray Palmer, what Palmer wanted to hear for a magazine story. So probably cooked up.
Okay, so maybe Maury Island's a dead end. But then you have the Captain Thomas Mantell incident in January 48. That was definitely real and tragic.
Absolutely. A Kentucky Air National Guard pilot killed while chasing an object near Fort Knox. He climbed too high without oxygen, chased this thing, lost consciousness, crashed. A definite tragedy that demanded answers.
And the Air Force explanations for what he was chasing kept shifting, didn't they? According to this source.
That's what the text highlights. First, maybe it was the planet Venus. Then, it was weather balloon. No, wait, maybe 2 weather balloons. Or some combination. And then later, the possibility came up it was maybe a secret Navy skyhook balloon project, which was classified back then.
So the source suggests the Air Force was basically guessing or covering.
The source puts it pretty bluntly. They were inventing explanations because they had a dead pilot on their hands and needed some kind of answer, any plausible answer, fast.
So you have these two things, a likely hoax and a real deadly crash within 6 months. The source argues this must have really ramped up the pressure on the military to figure out the riddle of the flying saucers.
Absolutely. It pushed them towards more formal assessments, like the military concept of an estimate of the situation, a formal intelligence analysis.
And there was a big one in 1948, prepared at Wright Field.
Yes. According to Ed Ruppelt, who later ran Project Blue Book, this top-secret estimate supposedly concluded that flying saucers were real interplanetary craft. Maybe from Mars, he thought, based on what they understood about space travel then.
But this document, it's never actually been found, has it?
No official record or copy exists, the source states. Only the accounts of Ruppelt and a few others who claim they saw it. Someone named Swords apparently described it to the author as a thick document with a black cover, listing specific unsolved cases involving credible people, like Arnold's sighting or weird stuff seen over Muroc Air Base, Lake Mead.
And General Vandenberg, the Air Force Chief of Staff, what was his reaction, supposedly?
According to a colonel interviewed in the source, Vandenberg didn't just dismiss a draft of this estimate, he apparently reviewed it seriously, didn't reject it out of hand.
Now, the source also talks about a verified document. Lieutenant General Nathan Twining's letter from September 23, 1947. That one's real.
Yes. The source confirms its provenance. It's in the National Archives. Twining sent it to Brigadier General George Shulgin. It was apparently based on a sort of mini-estimate by a Major George Garrett, who looked at 16 really unusual cases, some even before Arnold's sighting.
What were Garrett and Shulgin expecting?
Reportedly, they kind of expected to be told, look, this is some secret U.S. project way above your pay grade. Stand down.
But Twining's reply in that confirmed letter said what?
Twining basically said, no, this phenomenon looks real, and he formally recommended setting up a detailed study project, giving it priority, a security classification, and importantly, a code name.
And that leads to the official projects we know about.
Right. Project Sign came first, concluded it wasn't leftover German tech being used. Then came Project Grudge, which was given high priority, its purpose explicitly stated as collecting and evaluating UFO data for national security and distributing findings to relevant agencies and contractors.
But even as Grudge was supposedly downplaying things publicly.
Exactly. The source calls this a layer of the onion. Gorge's public conclusions talked about hysteria, hoaxes, misidentifications. But behind the scenes, the serious investigation continued at a high priority level.
And the source points to things like using the 462nd Air Intelligence Service Squadron for Blue Book field investigations later, in the early 50s, as proof of significant resources being dedicated.
Yeah, the argument made in the text is that all this adds up to a good circumstantial case, that some kind of oversight committee operating above Blue Book probably existed. The big question the source leaves hanging is, okay, if it existed, was it called MJ-12 or did it have some other name?
Which brings us right to those MJ-12 documents that burst onto the scene in the mid-1980s. How does the author of this source book handle them?
Well, the author is upfront, says they initially believed the documents were probably authentic, but then, through their own research, which is detailed in this book, they started finding inconsistencies and became much more skeptical.
And there was one specific inconsistency that really seemed to be a turning point for the author. Something about a crash in Del Rio, Texas.
Yes, exactly. One of the main MJ-12 papers, the Eisenhower Briefing Document, or EBD, it mentions this supposed UFO crash near Del Rio in 1950. The author had initially heard a story from a researcher named Warren Smith about letters from someone vacationing near Del Rio mentioning a crash. Seems like confirmation.
But then
Further investigation suggested Smith's story was, let's say, possibly embellished, maybe even made up, if that key detail in the EBD relied on a story that didn't hold up.
it makes you doubt the whole document.
Right. For the author, that casts serious doubt on the authenticity of at least that part, and maybe the whole EBD.
What about other bits of supposed proof, like that telex Bill Moore got from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations mentioning MJ-12, or the Cutler-Twining memo?
The source mentions Moore's telex, yeah, but points out the actual source for it was anonymous. It also brings up the Cutler-Twining memo, which was found in the National Archives. It talks about scheduling a briefing for the NSC-MJ-12 Special Studies Project in July 1954. These were definitely things presented as strong evidence for MJ-12.
But despite these, the author's overall stance in this book is skepticism.
Yes, skeptical, but, they state, always willing to re-examine if solid new evidence comes forward. The goal, as stated, is just trying to sort fact from fiction within this whole tangled mess, based on the available info.
So given that skepticism about the documents, the source then tries to find evidence for a real committee through witness interviews. Tell us about some of those, that colonel aiming for promotion, for instance.
Right, that's an interesting one. The author describes meeting him in a sort of awkward, neutral place. The colonel was friendly, but clearly very cautious, didn't want to risk his promotion to general.
Did he hint about Roswell, though?
He strongly implied that the real information about the crash and what was recovered was kept in compartments he didn't have access to, even with his top-secret clearance and high position. He seemed convinced the info was there, just, way above his need to know. He personally felt the secrecy policy was wrong, info should be shared, but he was bound by his oath.
So no direct classified reveals, but hints.
Exactly. He hinted Roswell was real by saying something like, nobody would care this much about a weather balloon. And he had this really telling quote about managing information. You operate as if you can contain the damage. If the other guy doesn't contradict you, then you're golden. Shows the mindset, maybe.
What happened when the author brought up MJ-12 specifically?
His response was cagey. I've never heard it used around here. The source interprets that as maybe a non-denial denial, but it also highlights the big problem, compartmentalization. An officer might genuinely not know about a super-secret project, even a big one. Plus, there's ego. If it was real, I would have known about it. Makes getting confirmation hard.
Then there's Brigadier General Arthur Exon, former commander at Wright-Patterson. What did he add?
Exon actually named names. He pointed to Stuart Symington, who was Assistant Secretary of War for Air back in 1947, as someone he believed controlled access to the Roswell stuff. Exon's list of who likely knew the most included Symington and other absolute top dogs like General Carl Spaatz.
The source also mentions Scanlon, commander at Roswell before 47.
Yeah, Scanlon knew the base, knew the area, had an Air Force intelligence background. The source suggests he'd be a logical member for any oversight committee formed right after the crash, given his expertise in secrecy and intelligence. An upper-level guy.
So the picture the source builds from testimony is that a committee likely formed almost instantly, like within hours of the crash, at the very top levels to exploit whatever they found.
Yes, with maybe the first unofficial meeting right there in Roswell. Probably with mostly lower-ranking folks present, except maybe General Ramey and Colonel Blanchard.
And there's testimony about stuff being flown out of Roswell quickly.
Yeah, a guy named Rickett apparently described seeing Major Marcel wrap up boxes, load them onto a plane with a pilot, specifically from Andrews Field, which is right near Washington, D.C. Another witness, Robert Porter, saw wrapped packages being loaded, noted no receipts were signed, packages weren't sealed. Suggests a quick off-the-books transfer. The base's own unit history for July 47 seemed to back up some flights occurring.
Now, Major Edwin Easley, the base provost marshal in 47, the source highlights his interview as particularly compelling.
Very much so. The author interviewed him in the early 90s. Easley's reaction was apparently very striking. He just kept repeating he could not talk about the crash, that he'd been sworn to secrecy over 30 years before, and the oath still held. For the author, that level of enduring secrecy, that refusal to talk even decades later, strongly suggested something really big, likely extraterrestrial, had happened.
Did Easley offer any details about the investigation itself?
He mentioned this outside group that came into Roswell and basically took charge of the core investigation. His military police guys were relegated to guarding the outer perimeter, where they couldn't see the important stuff happening inside.
And he mentioned someone connected to the president?
Yes, he claimed someone named Deviney, who he believed was a representative of President Truman, specifically came and got Easley's personal promise not to talk about what had gone on.
And the source includes that very poignant detail about Easley near the end of his life.
Right, reportedly on his deathbed, trying to say something. He mentioned the creatures, and then couldn't continue. The source uses Easley's whole testimony to suggest the event's magnitude, confirm this outside group, hint at early exploitation efforts, maybe corroborate presidential awareness, and give clues about who was really running the show.
The source also throws in other anecdotes, like interviewing an ex-sergeant who admitted faking UFO reports, but the detail about the weather balloon photo in his den is noted.
And the Levelland, Texas sightings from 1957. That case is used as an example of how UFO investigations seem to happen outside the normal Project Blue Book channels. You had multiple credible witnesses seeing objects, cars stalling, classic stuff, but the official Air Force explanation was quick and dismissive ball lightning in that case.
So the source uses Levelland to argue. What?
To argue circumstantially that someone else, some other group, was likely managing the really interesting UFO data, operating at a higher level than Blue Book. Maybe connected to something like Project Moondust, which officially recovered space debris but sometimes got linked to UFOs too.
So it builds this case for a real committee, handling real data. But the source still asks, okay, was that committee MJ-12 or did it have a different name entirely?
That's the lingering question based on the testimony part.
Okay, so the source presents this compelling testimony, hinting at a real event, real secrecy, maybe a real committee. But then it pivots hard back to the MJ-12 documents and lays out a ton of evidence against their authenticity. Let's dig into the problems the source finds.
Right. The author states that, in their view, the general consensus now, at least within the UFO community, is that most of those original MJ-12 documents that surfaced back in the 80s are probably fraudulent. They lack clear origin, they're full of mistakes, they just don't feel historically right. Though the author does note Stan Friedman strongly disagrees and defends them.
Let's go through the specific documents the source critiques, starting with that main one, the Eisenhower Briefing Document, the EBD.
We touched on it. The Del Rio crash mentioned it seems based on that shaky, possibly fabricated story from Warren Smith. That was a big red flag for the author. The EBD also apparently gives a location for the Roswell crash site that doesn't quite match other accounts or beliefs from the time. These kinds of inconsistencies made the author conclude the EBD was likely not authentic.
What about the famous Truman Memo, supposedly authorizing MJ-12, often found attached to the EBD?
That one gets hit hard in the source. It's presented as a special executive order. But problems jump out. The date format 92447 isn't how sequential executive orders were numbered. There's debate about special classified orders existing outside the sequence, but the source cites the Congressional Research Service saying, no, even secret EOs were numbered in sequence, just sometimes weren't published publicly.
So the format itself is suspicious, according to this analysis.
Yes, the content and format just don't seem to align with how things were actually done then. And then there are the forensic issues the source brings up. The signature, Truman's signature, is placed weirdly low on the page, uncharacteristically low.
And the typewriter.
That's presented as a potential smoking gun. A forensic expert, Peter Teitel, is cited as identifying the typeface as most likely from a Smith Corona P102 model typewriter.
Okay. And when was that typewriter made?
After 1966. So if the memo is dated 1947 or even 1952, as some versions might imply, and it's typed on a machine that didn't exist until the late 60s.
That's a pretty big problem.
Teitel apparently called it a slam dunk proof of forgery based on the dating. He also, according to the source, identified the signature itself as not original, but a demonstrable transplanted signature, like it was lifted photographically from a real Truman document and pasted onto this fake one.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty damning if accurate, as presented here. What about the Cutler-Twining memo, the one found in the archives?
That one has issues too, according to the source. It uses the classification marking top secret restricted. The source says this is problematic because top secret and restricted were two different classification levels at the time.
Right.
Eisenhower Library staff apparently confirmed that this marking was incorrect for an original document from 1954. Restricted had actually become confidential by then, under Eisenhower's rules.
But didn't Friedman argue there were examples of mixed markings?
He did, but the source counters that Friedman's examples seem to be documents that were downgraded later, resulting in multiple markings, not documents originally issued with that specific incorrect mixed classification.
So the source argues this memo, instead of proving MJ-12, its own questionable nature actually undermines the case.
Pretty much. It can't be used to validate the other questionable documents if it's questionable itself. Then you have the Aquarius, Telexmore, and Shendera, who analyzed it, concluded it was likely a hybrid of real and disinformation.
Yeah.
Not solid proof.
And the alleged briefing for President Carter.
That's another strange one. Bill Moore and Linda Moulton Howe both claimed they saw notes or a briefing paper, but no copies ever surfaced. Howe's version, which she said was shown to her by Air Force intelligence operative Richard Doty, is described in the source as just rife with errors and faked crashes. It supposedly mentioned the Aztec, New Mexico crash in '48 and one in Kingman, Arizona in '53 crashes. Doty himself later admitted weren't real.
And Doty's behavior was odd.
Yeah, the source mentions him acting strangely when showing Howe the document, like telling her where to sit because eyes can see through windows. Very cloak and dagger, maybe unnecessarily so. Moore and Shendera didn't give a firm opinion on the notes they saw, but given Moore's later admissions about spreading disinformation...
You have to be suspicious.
Right. The source concludes there's good reason to reject the Carter briefing story as validation for MJ-12, calling the alleged document likely a conglomeration of fact, fiction, and fantasy.
Then came that flood of thousands of pages of supposed new MJ-12 documents, mostly linked to Timothy Cooper and his source, Thomas Cantwell.
Yeah, around 4,000 pages. The source says the first batches didn't impress many people. Even some MJ-12 believers thought they looked fake. One example given is a memorandum for the president that mentions magic.
MAJIC.
Right. This source suggests this was probably just a retyped copy of a real memo about WWII code breaking, which was codenamed Magic, deliberately used to make you think it was related to MJ-12, playing on the similar name.
There's also that comparison the source makes between two documents with the exact same handwritten note on them.
Yes, that's a key point about provenance. One document, a Wiedemeyer memo, has that scribbled note, and its history can be traced back legitimately to the Truman White House files in the archives. The other document, a Twining memo, with the identical scribble, can only be traced back as far as this batch of Cooper documents.
So one's verifiable, the other isn't.
Exactly. The lack of an independent, verifiable source for the Twining memo with the note argues strongly against its authenticity, suggesting maybe the note was copied onto it. The trail for these Cooper documents just kind of ends with Cooper and his anonymous source, Cantwell. No solid government origin.
And then there's the alleged first annual report of MJ-12, supposedly from 1952. The source points out some big historical problems and anachronisms in that one.
Oh yeah, major ones. It supposedly references ADIC interrogation reports last dated December 1950. Problem. ADIC, the Air Technical Intelligence Center, wasn't even formed until May 1951. How could it have reports from 1950?
Doesn't make sense.
It also apparently contradicts the EBD about where the Roswell crash happened, suggesting a different site near the Trinity atomic bomb test area, which isn't supported by other evidence outside these MJ-12 docs.
What else? The DEW line.
Mentions the DEW line, the Distant Early Warning Radar Network, in 1950. But the DEW line wasn't constructed until 1954 or later, and the name itself wasn't even coined until 1952.
And Project Moondust.
Mentions a Moondust team involved in 1950. Project Moondust, for recovering space debris, didn't officially start until the fall of 1957.
Project Stork.
Claims Project Stork was for crash retrievals, The source states Stork was actually a contract with the Battelle Memorial Institute for analyzing UFO reports, not retrieving wreckage.
And the most famous one, the term retrovirus.
Right. The document, supposedly written in 1952, uses the term retrovirus. But, as the source points out, that scientific term simply didn't exist in 1952. It entered the lexicon after 1970, following Nobel Prize-winning work by Temin in Baltimore.
How could they use a term that wouldn't be invented for almost 20 years?
Exactly. The source dismisses attempts to explain it away, like maybe it meant retrograde virus, as unreasonable stretches. These anachronisms strongly suggest the document was created much later than 1952, pointing towards fraud.
The source also mentions Timothy Cooper failing a polygraph test related to the documents, and emails surfacing that suggested the whole thing might have been a deliberate hoax he was involved in.
Yes, those points are included as further reasons to doubt the Cooper documents. So, weighing all this, the inconsistencies, the major anachronisms, the forensic findings like the typewriter and signature, the lack of verifiable provenance, the source's conclusion is pretty stark. These documents cannot be trusted and are probably all forgeries.
Okay, so the source makes a very strong case that the specific MJ-12 documents are likely fakes. Yet the author still holds on to the idea, based on testimony, that there are traces of a real oversight committee. How does the source bridge that gap?
It really comes back to the weight given to that witness testimony we discussed earlier, the general, the colonels, Easley. Their accounts, their hints about deep secrecy, oaths, outside groups, presidential involvement. The source argues that this testimony points towards something real happening, some kind of genuine high-level secret group, even if the famous MJ-12 documents themselves aren't it.
What about the FBI investigation into the original MJ-12 leak? Some people say that proves the government took them seriously.
The source addresses that directly. It clarifies that, yes, the FBI did investigate when the documents first surfaced, because they looked like potentially leaked classified material, and the FBI is legally required to investigate such things. And this is key. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI, quickly told the FBI the documents were bogus, probably forgeries.
So the investigation shifted.
Right. It became a criminal investigation into potential forgery and fraud, not an investigation to authenticate the documents as real classified material. So the source argues, the FBI investigation absolutely does not legitimize MJ-12. If anything, it reinforces the idea they were seen as fakes by the relevant authorities early on.
Let's loop back to General Exxon's testimony for a second, the names he mentioned.
That's presented as another piece of evidence against the documents. Exxon pointed to people like Stuart Symington, Kenneth Royal, Secretary of War, James Forstall, soon-to-be Secretary of Defense, absolute top civilian and military brass in 47 as the ones likely in the know about Roswell.
And the point is?
The crucial point the source makes is, none of those key individuals named by Exxon are actually listed as members on the official MJ-12 roster found in the documents. If Exxon, a high-ranking insider, was pointing towards the real players, and they're not on the MJ-12 list, well, that makes the MJ-12 list itself look wrong, suggesting, again, the documents are probably fraudulent.
Plus the overall lack of any authenticated government paper trail mentioning MJ-12.
Correct. The source emphasizes that point repeatedly. No document bearing the MJ-12 designation has ever been found through normal archival research, traced within government systems, or independently verified as authentic.
But the source does find evidence in the National Archives for a real classified project with a very similar name, right?
Yes, and this is presented as quite significant. Researchers found properly archived, authenticated documents referring to a project codenamed Majestic. For example, a Joint Outline Emergency War Plan Majestic, dated October 2, 1952.
But this was a war plan, not UFOs.
Exactly. It was a contingency plan related to potential war scenarios, completely unrelated to UFOs.
So how does the source use this finding against MJ-12?
First, it highlights that these real Majestic documents have all the proper classification markings, correct dating formats, everything you'd expect, a stark contrast to the errors found on the alleged MJ-12 documents. Second, another verified document found at NARA, Naval Activities, Atomic Energy, from September 52, also relates to this war plan Majestic, confirming the codename was definitely in use for a real, highly classified military project at that time.
And the conclusion drawn from that?
The source argues it's highly unlikely, given security protocols, that the military would assign the exact same top-secret codename, Majestic, to two completely different, highly classified projects simultaneously. One a war plan, one a supposed UFO group. Therefore, the documented existence of the real Majestic war plan is presented as basically a final blow to MJ-12, strongly suggesting the name was already taken, and its use in the UFO documents is another indicator of forgery.
So the source wraps up its case against the MJ-12 documents by summarizing these key points.
Yes. The total lack of authenticated government documents mentioning MJ-12 or any traceability, the inclusion of already discredited stories like Robert Willingham's 1960s tale about a crashed saucer within the EBD itself, and crucially, that forensic evidence from Tytel about the Truman Memo's transplanted signature, which the source calls the absolute final blow.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into these specific sources, let's just quickly summarize the narrative arc this text presents.
Right. We began with those dramatic, confusing initial reports from Roswell in '47, the flying saucer announcement, Marcel's and Brazel's accounts of strange debris, the immediate military clampdown. That naturally led to the question, was a secret committee formed?
Then we saw how the source explored the early military context, the pressure from the Arnold sightings, the Mantell tragedy leading to official projects like Sign and Grudge, but also hints from intelligence estimates and Twining's letter suggesting a deeper classified interest, building that circumstantial case for some kind of committee.
Then, bang, the MJ-12 documents surface in the '80s. The source describes the author's journey from initial belief to skepticism, triggered by inconsistencies like that questionable Del Rio crash story embedded in the EBD.
Since the documents seemed shaky, the source then looked for a real committee through witness testimony, people like Exxon, the unnamed colonel, Major Easley, whose accounts, though often veiled in secrecy, hinted strongly at a real extraordinary event, an outside group, high-level awareness, suggesting something was going on, even if MJ-12 wasn't its name.
But ultimately, the source dives deep into debunking the documents themselves. It presents a really extensive critique based on historical errors, major anachronisms like retrovirus or the do-W line dates, the serious lack of provenance for many documents, and especially that forensic evidence, the typewriter dating, the transplanted signature on the Truman Memo.
And as a final piece, the source reveals the existence of that real, verified Majestic War Plan project, arguing the codename was already in use, making its appearance on the UFO documents highly suspect.
So based only on the information and analysis presented in these specific source excerpts, the conclusion drawn is pretty clear. While something significant might well have happened at Roswell, and witness testimony provides intriguing hints of a real secret committee, the actual MJ-12 documents that became so famous are, according to this text, most likely elaborate hoaxes or perhaps disinformation, full of detectable flaws.
That wraps up our deep dive into this particular set of complex, fascinating, and often contradictory sources on Roswell and MJ-12.
Yeah, it really underscores, based on this text anyway, how critical things like provenance, historical context, and forensic analysis are when you're trying to untangle fact from fiction in areas like this. Meticulous work is needed.
So where does that leave us? If the most famous documents are likely fakes, as this source argues so strongly, what does that mean? Could there still be real information locked away? What genuine secrets about 1947, if any, might still be waiting in some dusty archive, or perhaps emerge through future credible testimony that can be verified? What was the real story, if not MJ-12?
Keep learning, keep questioning, and join us next time for another deep dive.